So I want to talk about today's big news development, which is that the UK, Canada, and Australia have formally recognised the state of Palestine. So there's a lot to break down here. Bear with me. I did hear the Prime Minister's speech. I also heard a discussion on a radio station. I'm not sure which radio station it was because I just kind of came into it. But what caught my attention is a debate between the Conservative MP Alex Burgert, who is the MP for Brentwood and Ongar, and the Liberal Democrat MP Munira Wilson, who's MP for Twickenham. And she pointed out that there are Conservatives in Burgert's party, like Sir Alan Duncan, who are embarrassed by their party line on this. That is to say, that they think Israel's gone too far. Burgert was just taking the attitude of a lot of pro-Israelis, a lot of apologists for Israel, saying that Hamas will welcome this and completely ignoring the Palestinian suffering. The most he could muster up was regarding the settlement building was, well, of course, Israel should stick within the law. It was a very vapid response. Now, the Prime Minister's speech made it clear, as he always does, that he's against Hamas, and he said that actually a viable two-state solution, which includes security for Israel, is the antithesis of the hateful agenda of Hamas. The Australians have said that any future Palestinian state or any viable Palestinian state mustn't have Hamas in it. I think the motivation for this recognition, this coordinated recognition, I believe Portugal is also recognising it today, and France is on the cusp of recognising it. This is the vast majority of the international community, and I'm going to break down the very few countries now that don't recognise this, and I suspect some of them will change their stance as well, given the international trajectory. But I think the main motivation for doing so is the idea that the dream of a Palestinian state is dying, and now is the time to sort of keep that concept alive, because Netanyahu's already retaliated. They're threatening even more settlement expansion, illegal settlement expansion. The sheer arrogance of the Netanyahu regime, that the only reason they're getting away with what they're doing is because of the United States. And dare I say, there's something I actually agree with some MAGA people on, which is that, and some of Starmer's critics, why is it that he waited until after Trump left to make this announcement? Now, I understand he couldn't have made it on the same day as the state visit, but he could have made this announcement perhaps a few days before. It does look a little bit like avoiding this issue with Trump, but regardless, I think it's the right thing to do, because the right to self-determination, the right to the dignity of nationhood is something that everyone should have, and it's something that the Palestinians have long been calling for, and it's also long-standing Labour policy. So really, as important as this announcement is, it's not really surprising, and it shouldn't really be that controversial, because it's simply Labour doing what has long been their policy. There's a lot of things to break down. Of course, it's not going to change anything on the ground. It isn't going to end the suffering anytime soon. But this is coming in the same week that what's happening in Gaza has been formally declared by the UN a genocide. It's official. And Israel's apologists will say, how can it be genocide when, they'll say things like, if Israel really wanted to kill everyone, they would. If this was really genocide, then Israel wouldn't allow any aid in. Actually, Israel has been significantly restricting aid. They're letting a little trickle of aid in here and there. It's nowhere near enough. The airdrops, as The Guardian reported earlier this year, can actually be dangerous. They can kill people, and there have been a few examples of people either drowning trying to get the aid in the sea, or actually being killed by the airdrops themselves. It's a horrendous situation right now. It might be possibly the worst place on earth, and there's quite a few candidates right now. But I saw an image of a little girl, and it almost looked like she had no feet, but I looked closely, and she was so ragged, and her feet were kind of in the dirt, so you could barely see them, and she was carrying the meager possessions that she had. Um, Israel always does this thing whereby they say, we'll give advance warning before we slaughter dozens of people. Where the hell are these people supposed to go? Now, there may be an argument that countries like Egypt should be doing more, but they naturally would have a security crisis if they are inundated with refugees. Um, Israel has expanded its war now. That's not all one-sided, I get that. But 5 more killed in Lebanon. A few weeks ago, Qatar, Yemen, Iran. Iran is Iran. It definitely has a lot of blood on its hands in the region. I am no fan of the Iranian regime, but there's a practical argument here, leaving aside the moral things. It seems incredibly reckless for Israel to be opening up all these fronts. I mean, yes, Hamas has representatives in Qatar, but was that really a sensible thing to target yet another country? Even the United States criticised that because it is a sovereign country. I think that the situation is very, very grim, and obviously recognising the Palestinians say it isn't going to end the situation on the ground. And even the Palestinians have said that it's not necessarily, they appreciate this, but they also, when you hear Arabic voices on this, not just Palestinians but Arabs in general, it always comes back to regarding the British position, Balfour. That's always the starting point. And it may be seen as one of our worst foreign policy blunders ever, actually, the Balfour Declaration. But, anyone who says that the history of that region of the Levant is black and white is being disingenuous. But I will say, looking at today's situation, if Donald Trump really wants a Nobel Peace Prize, he could end this situation. He said he would end the Ukraine war on day one. Well, that's nonsense. But in the case of Israel, I believe he could legitimately change direction, because the United States of America is the one country that enables Israel to do what it's doing with impunity, effectively. I mean, the UN can say it's genocide, there could be international recognition of Palestine, there could be international criticism of Israel, but Israel continues to have American support, and that is a very, very critical thing. I do believe without American support, I don't know if even the hawks of Netanyahu's cabinet would be doing what they're doing. Now, domestically, thinking specifically with Britain, of course there'll be some domestic politics at play, because the Labour left have long been angry about Starmer dragging his feet on this. It is true that the government's been very vocal about Israel. David Lammy got into a very heated debate with Priti Patel on this. And the government has clearly condemned Israel's excess. They've also put sanctions on settlers and even some Israeli cabinet ministers. I think it's fair to say Anglo-Israeli relations right now are pretty bad. That's understandable given what Israel is doing. But then that's coupled with the fact that, Palestine action has been prescribed. I think they have done some criminal things. I don't think it's, unlike some people, I don't think it's harmless to vandalise RAF planes. I think criminal action should be prosecuted. That's not, I think that crosses line. However, when you have peaceful protesters, and I mean peaceful, I'm not talking about people blocking roads or engaging in vandalism. I'm talking about people literally holding up placards, and that's it. And then mass arrests happening. A, it's using up police resources, that could be spent on dealing with crime. And B, it does look heavy-handed. It does look disproportionate. Whatever people think of Palestine action, that isn't, for them to swoop in and arrest dozens of people holding placards when they were extremely slow to act to the likes of Just Stop Oil. There's questions to be raised over that. And again, this gets into policing issues, but the government just seems to have, prescribing that group on one hand, most of the members of which are peaceful. I think there's only a hardcore element there that are genuinely willing to engage in criminal actions or who are anti-Semitic or pro-Hamas. But I think that just looks like mixed messaging. You know, to prescribe people who are criticizing Israel, but then to take the government line of criticizing Israel. President Herzog visited London recently, controversially so, but the government will argue that was for the Prime Minister to express criticism of Israel. And I suppose it could be argued what better way to do that than to say it to his face. Netanyahu can't come here because he would have to be arrested if he did. Of course, the Israelis have been lashing out after today's announcements and, threatening. Apparently, Netanyahu was threatening Prime Minister Albanese. The way Netanyahu's regime operates is you're with us or you're against us, and it's this idea that if you argue for any sort of dignity for the Palestinians, then you must be pro-Hamas. I think Israel's lost a lot of support with its attitude, with its this kind of black and white mentality that, even it's not enough for governments to criticise Hamas, clearly criticise Hamas. It's not enough that governments say the hostages should be released. What Israel demands is absolute 100% support for them, no matter what they do. They seem to think that self-defence means they can act with impunity. And unfortunately, they have been getting away with it. The other thing about the British position is, sanctions and recognising Palestinians, all of that won't count for anything if we don't completely cut off arms to Israel, because it just looks like, we're playing double games here. I welcome it, but I think we need to completely cut off support to Israel. I will say this, though. Frankly, there are some pro-Israel groups and some Jewish groups, it has to be said, that are playing a manipulative approach to this. They will say that any support for the Palestinians, any criticism of Israel equals anti-Semitism. And they'll evoke the Holocaust, which is kind of perverse given that there's Holocaust survivors who have criticised what Israel's doing. But, for example, there was a group in Germany that said, as a state policy, Germany should never criticise Israel, ever. Now, obviously, Germany has a unique situation given the historic, the dark history there. That it's no secret of why it would be taboo for a German government to criticise Israel. But I believe 80 years after the war, Germany's a democracy. Germany has long moved on from that past. I think Germany should have the right to determine its foreign policy based on what they determine is right, rather than being shackled by the wrongs of the past. But, the situation on the ground is dire. Another 68 people killed yesterday. And when the likes of Alex Burghardt and other Israel apologists come out with, it's always the starting point of October the 7th. But the conflict didn't begin then. That was an incredibly stupid escalation by Hamas. And it was immoral because innocent people were killed and hostages were taken, and it was horrendous. But, Trump in his press conference of Starmer the other day said to Robert Peston, do you know what happened on October the 7th? It's like this idea that it's been forgotten. The entire military campaign by Israel is about that event. So the idea that it's been forgotten is utter nonsense. Also, and it's a point worth bearing in mind that isn't maybe brought up enough, we talk about the hostages held by Hamas, and it's awful. They're civilian hostages, but what about the many, many Palestinians held in Israeli jails without trial? Arguably they're hostages as well. You could look at it that way, because these people haven't been given trials in many cases, and some of them are minors. So I think that for a long, long time, much of the Arab world has been angry about the double standards from the West on Israel, and only recently has Western countries really been turning against Israel. Whilst Arab countries are in no position to, Arab governments I'm talking about here are in no position to lecture on morality given their appalling human rights abuses and their own repression of dissent. I mean, a country like Iran is in absolutely no position to lecture the West given how they murder and torture their own people. But nevertheless, and I'm not saying it's an Arab country, I know it's not, but I'd expand that to Middle Eastern countries. But regardless, it is true that for too long there's been double standards, that there's this attitude that, frankly, Israeli civilian lives matter more than Palestinian civilian lives. What else can explain these people whose knee-jerk reaction is to always, always defend Israel? It's like they just don't care about Palestinian deaths. It's the United States government, it's conservatives in this country, and it's also some publications. I would single out the Daily Telegraph. Their coverage of this conflict has been so obscenely biased. It's just bad journalism. It's almost like, as an editorial policy, they've decided they're just not going to talk about Palestinian suffering and what's causing that suffering. Yes, Hamas, but also Israel's military actions. This famine is not an accident, it's man-made. I'm going to just read out the countries now that are not recognising a Palestinian state or haven't done so yet. They are a minority. The United States, no surprise there. And within Europe, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Greece, North Macedonia, Kosovo, surprisingly, being with a Muslim majority, I'm surprised by that. Moldova, Eritrea, Cameroon, Panama in Central America. Let me see here. Burma, South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, and there's some Pacific nations. And that's it. France is on the cusp of recognising Palestine, and there's some countries that are kind of 50-50. Of course, Israel itself doesn't. There's some countries that are kind of half recognise it and half don't, but the New Zealand also doesn't. Somewhat surprised by that. But anyway, the majority of the world now recognises Palestine. Of course, what will that involve? It would be Gaza and the West Bank, which are separated, I think it's about 50 miles. Israel now is aggressively going to go into the West Bank. The sanctions apparently don't mean anything. The risk there is they could just cut off the two Palestinian communities. And for a long time, there's been a concern that the West Bank will be the next Gaza. There's already been hundreds killed there. Yes, some settlers have been killed, but the settlers have also engaged in extreme violence. I think, quite frankly, I think a lot of them are far-right thugs who have violently attacked, in some cases, elderly Palestinians. In many cases, these are people who have come, frankly, from Brooklyn, and they haven't been there for generations. I used to defend Israel's argument because, I'll be quite honest about this, I used to defend Israel's right to the land because of the historic Kingdom of Israel, the biblical Kingdom of Israel. It's true that long predates any Islamic claims to the region, but if you're going to go down that line and use ancient entities, ancient kingdoms to justify today's political situation, then many political geographical boundaries around the world would have to change. Now, I think it is going too far to say Israel shouldn't exist. I think that sort of mindset will never happen, and no Western country would ever go down that path. Not that Netanyahu cares, because he just conflates, giving some dignity to the Palestinians with being pro-Hamas. But I think that I have started to change some of my thinking in terms of, I'll be honest, I was always, not always, but a lot of the time I was somewhat biased Israel. I would always play the devil's advocate. I'd always argue their line, and I'm just done with it now, because I think what they've done in the last 2 years, it is genocide. And by the way, this isn't just Western countries and Arab countries, and most of the world says this. There's many Israelis who are deeply uncomfortable with what's happening. Thousands of Israelis have been protesting. Some of the biggest voices against what's going on in Gaza are groups like the Jewish Voice for Peace. That's why I don't think that right-wing Jewish groups should be allowed to say that they alone are the voice of the Jewish people. And I think it's extremely manipulative and frankly contemptible that they use anti-Semitism to try and silence debate. It's a bit like the way some Islamists use Islamophobia to silence debate. Anti-Semitism is a problem. And I think, I've always shunned anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But that's the truth. There are Jewish groups right-wing Jewish groups who try to use this as a way to silence criticism of Israel. It's an attack on free speech and it's disingenuous. I'll wrap this up, but I welcome the move. The Liberal Democrats argue it's long overdue. Many Labour people on the left have argued it's overdue. And not for the first time, Starmer will be accused of just pandering to pressure within his party. And, this, not for the first time, he will be seen as a Prime Minister having to move with dissent rather than moving of his own accord. There might be some basis to that. I do think that Starmer needs to be a lot more willing to condemn Trump, or at least speak up against Trump. Because, Blair was accused of being Bush's poodle. Starmer really runs the risk of being seen as Trump's poodle. This issue was brought up in the press conference, and Trump again, I mentioned Israel apologists. He just said, I asked the hostages, was there any humanity there? Was there any humanity? It's always, the American right seem to have this mentality that Palestinian suffering doesn't count. It's always the starting point of Israeli suffering. What about Palestinian suffering? I mean, if Trump wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, it's grotesque. The extreme bias that they show. Rubio was at the Wailing Wall the other day. Why couldn't Rubio have visited Palestinian refugees? Or at least someone from the Palestinian side. The extreme American bias, I think, is one of the biggest threats to peace in that region. The extreme American bias, especially from this administration. Jimmy Carter, the late Jimmy Carter, to his credit, I think really, really made arguably more efforts than anyone else, except Bill Clinton. But Trump is a massive liability in that region. He isn't an asset, and he's sure as hell not going to get the Nobel Peace Prize so long as he is continuing to fund the Israeli war machine and what Israel is doing there, which is genocide. So I think my country has made the right decision. We're not immediately going to get thanked by the Palestinians because of the historic grievances over the Balfour Declaration. But this is in keeping with the international community. It's also, incidentally, in keeping with long-standing Labour Party policy. So really, it shouldn't be that surprising. But all those people whose first attitude to this is, what about Hamas? Well, yes, I'm aware that Hamas is gloating about it and saying they welcome it. But should government policy be determined on how Hamas reacts? I don't think so. It should be determined on what's the right thing to do. And not only has this been long-standing policy, but it's about keeping that principle alive, the idea that people have a right to the dignity of nationhood. What the Palestinian spokesman said, who was talking to the BBC correspondent, I don't have the name off the top of my head, I'll put a link to the news report. He said, we welcome this, but it's about the dignity of the Palestinian people. It's about keeping this alive. And he said that there was something, brain freeze, there was something else poignant he said. Anyway, I'll put a link to that video. But Netanyahu is, in my view, corrupt. I think he's a liar. I think he presides over an extremist administration, far-right administration. We hear about about Hamas dehumanizing the Israelis and Jewish people, and they do have a genocidal manifesto. But frankly, so does the current Israeli government. Netanyahu's regime has enabled extremists. I've seen footage of settlers violently attacking Palestinians, and instead of backing their own police, Israeli police, Netanyahu's government has backed those settlers. That's a disgrace. And it should tell you everything you need to know about this in terms of the direction the Israeli government's taking. All the talk of the hostages families, I understand, are angry with Netanyahu's government. They don't believe that their loved ones are a priority. And it's sickening when Trump was actually talking about turning that into real estate. It is absolutely sickening. I mean, he's talking about doing that on to put it bluntly, the bodies of 66,000 people, plus many of them civilians. So I think the government's made the right step, but the other important thing to note is, in these announcements, I know Australia said that Hamas can't be part of any future government. So this isn't like we're recognising the Palestinian state but we want Hamas to be part of it. They have been very clear that they also condemn Hamas. So it's a balancing act. I think for any state, I remember now what I was going to say. The Palestinian spokesman said, okay, you don't want a two-state solution. Netanyahu's regime is aggressively against it. Well, then at least give us a viable democratic state where there isn't this fascistic idea that only Jewish people have a right to the land. And there is something to be said for that. This idea that, the Jewish people are God's chosen people and they alone have a right to the land. The Palestinians didn't come there yesterday. They've been there for generations and generations and generations, and that can't be ignored. So I'm going to round this up because my throat's getting a little bit iffy. But my goodness, compared to what the Palestinians are going through, it's minuscule. It is a hideous situation out there, and these announcements won't change anything on the ground, but it is significant in terms of the geopolitical direction. And I would not at all be surprised if some of those other countries consider recognising the Palestinians as well. But I think for that to be viable, there need to be some sort of connection, like a highway or some sort of link between the West Bank and Gaza, and Israel's doing everything it can to ensure that doesn't happen. Netanyahu's running a criminal regime, and it's a regime that's covered in the blood of thousands of Palestinian civilians. It sickens me that Israel's apologists don't seem to care about this. They don't seem to care that thousands of civilians are being killed. They're paying, it's a collective punishment. And it's always about towing the Israeli narrative. Oh, they give them advance warning. Just because Israel's allowed some aid in and just because they give warnings on airstrikes doesn't mean that they're not engaging in genocide, because the conditions are absolutely there. And it has been formally recognised now at UN level. That's not insignificant. And with that, I'll wrap this up. But I welcome it, but I think we need to go further. We need to completely stop arms to Israel, and Starmer, frankly, needs to be more prepared to criticise Trump.